Good evening. On behalf of the organizing committee and of Ball State University, let me welcome you to the opening session of Thoreau in His Time and Ours, a symposium. Your enthusiasm in attending tonight justifies our enthusiasm in planning since last August, and so we thank you for coming. We thank as well those generous sponsors listed in your program for their support, the various colleges and departments at Ball State University, the Canterbury Episcopal Fellowship, and the Indiana Committee for the Humanities. When Henry David Thoreau left Walden Pond in 1847, after 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days of observing, thinking, writing, and, in his words, fronting life deliberately, he claimed that he had several more lives to live. Our gathering here tonight is testimony to the rightness of that claim. Nearly a century and a quarter after his death, Thoreau's words and Thoreau's ideas remain vital, the legacy of an American writer who confronted in his time issues and opportunities that confront us in our own. Much of importance will be said about Thoreau these 2 days, and I'm reluctant to delay things much longer. But do allow me to introduce to you, please, the speakers and discussion leaders who will be featured tonight and during the sessions tomorrow. Professor George Wolfe of Ball State School of Music, who has also served as chair of the symposium committee. Professor Richard Schneider of the English Department at Atlantic Christian College in North Carolina. Professor Charles Mortensen, chair of the Department of Natural Resources at Ball State University. Professor Leonard Neufeld of the English and American Studies departments at Purdue University. Professor George Hendrick of the University of Illinois. And our keynote speaker, Dr. Francis B. Dedmond, Distinguished Service Professor of English at Catawba College, Salisbury, North Carolina. No one with a lick of sense would presume to speak for Thoreau, but I'm betting that even he would be pleased with the distinguished gathering of lecturers and respondents and other participants who are here for these 2 days to speak about him. They and I encourage you to speak as well. We welcome your questions, we welcome your comments, and we most heartily welcome you. The first program this evening will be a musical recital. One of the featured performers will be George Wolfe. Mr. Wolfe holds a Master's of Music in Performance from Indiana University. He has studied with Eugene Rousseau and with Daniel Defayet at the Paris Conservatory of Music. While at Indiana University, Mr. Wolfe was awarded a Performer's Certificate in recognition of outstanding artistry. Mr. Wolfe is currently an Assistant Professor of Music at Ball State University and Chairman of the Conference Committee. Joining him will be Judy Herring, who is a doctoral fellow at Ball State. She's formerly taught at MacPhail Center for the Arts in Minneapolis, and she is currently music director at WBST in Muncie. George Wolfe has asked me to introduce the recital the best way I know how, which is to let Thoreau introduce it himself. Toward the end of a chapter entitled Higher Laws in Thoreau's book Walden, Thoreau presents what I think is one of the most vivid tableaus in the book, a scene in which a man named John Farmer sits at the end of the day and thinks. Thoreau says, John Farmer sat at his door one September evening after a hard day's work, his mind still running on his labor more or less. Having bathed, he sat down to recreate his intellectual man. It was a rather cool evening, and some of his neighbors were apprehending a frost. He'd not attended to the train of his thoughts long when he'd heard someone playing on a flute, and that sound harmonized with his mood. Still he thought of his work, but the burden of his thought was that though this kept running in his head, and he found himself planning and contriving it against his will, yet it concerned him very little. It was no more than the scurf of his skin which was constantly shuffed off, but the notes of the flute came home to his ears out of a different sphere from that he worked in, and suggested work for certain faculties which slumbered in him. They gently did away with the street and the village and the state in which he lived. A voice said to him, why do you stay here and live this mean, moiling life when a glorious existence is possible for you? Those same stars twinkle over other fields than these. But how to come out of this condition and actually migrate thither? All that he could think of was to practice some new austerity, to let his mind descend into his body and redeem it, and to treat himself with ever-increasing respect. That kind of writing's why we're here tonight. George Wolfe and Judy Herring.
chose the piece for this evening's Six Metamorphoses after Ovid by Benjamin Britten because it is based on Greek mythological themes. And in his writings, Henry Thoreau often referred to Greek mythology. This particular piece of music is somewhat programmatic, so I thought I'd comment a little bit on each movement. The first movement is entitled Pan, and Pan is playing on his reed pipe. It is a kind of a pastorale setting, and you'll hear a little motif in the middle, which sort of reminds me at least of the chirping of birds. The second movement, titled Phaeton, is about someone who rode a chariot, the chariot of the sun, for one day and was hurled into a river by a thunderbolt. I think you'll see from the music that his ride on the chariot was rather raucous. Third movement is a lament for a goddess who is lamenting the death of her 14 children and was turned into a mountain. fourth movement depicts a feast at which is heard the shouting out of boys and the gaggling, tattling tongues of women. It's kind of a chauvinistic movement. But, the first theme you'll hear, sort of a barroom theme, has a lot of raucous rhythms, and that must be the boys. And later on, it's kind of a playful little motive, which probably is the gaggling women. Movement 5, Narcissus, someone who fell in love with his own image and became a flower. Now, this movement depicts him looking into a pool or pond, a still pond, and seeing his image. And in the middle, you'll hear a motive played in the low register rather loudly, and then it's reflected, in a sense, in the upper register, which is depicting the reflection of his image in the pond. final movement, Arethusa, who is flying from the love of Alpheus, the river god, was turned into a fountain. And in the middle, there's a little motif where there are a lot of trills, and it appears to me that that is representative of the rippling of water of the fountain. dance beforehand. Judy. Wasn't on the program.
It's a pleasure indeed to welcome you to this lecture this evening on Thoreau and his time and ours. Our speaker this evening for the keynote address is really a remarkable individual. Among other things, I have learned that he has chaired 2 different departments of English for a grand total of 32 years. And that is a feat, believe me, well worth mentioning. He has also, during the 1980s, in amidst other things, been the president of 2 athletic conferences. The South Atlantic Conference, which reportedly is the best little football conference in the United States, and the Carolinas Intercollegiate Athletic Conference. Our speaker, Dr. Francis B. Edmond, be Dedmond, the Distinguished Service Professor of English at Catawba College, took his MA at Duke and his PhD at Florida State. He's written prolifically on Thoreau, on Emerson, and other transcendentalists. He is, as many of you are aware, a colleague right now of Steve Wooster, who is one of our former colleagues. He has been at Catawba for almost 2 decades now. He is well known for his work on Thoreau and the ethical concept of government, on economic protest in Thoreau's work, on Thoreau and slavery, and on the influence of Thoreau's Walden on 20th century figures. He will talk to us this evening on many things to many people, Thoreau in his time and ours. Professor Dedmond.
I wish my wife could have heard all those good things just said about me. I've been in Muncie now some 5 hours, and I have enjoyed thoroughly your hospitality up to this time, and I'm looking forward to the rest of my stay here. Steve Wooster, I would like to think, is a colleague, but really he's the boss. Henry Thoreau, and I go back for nearly 40 years, and I'm not going to be any more specific than that. But never in my most transcendental moment did I ever dream, or should I have said perceive intuitively, that one day that association would result in my being invited to Ball State the day after All Fools' Day in this year of grace, 1986, to enjoy with you your first Thoreau symposium. Given the number of Thoreau scholars, and some of them are in this room right here tonight, given the number of Thoreau scholars there are throughout the length and breadth of the land, I am not unmindful of the singular honor you have paid me in inviting me to be your keynote speaker for this occasion. Henry David Thoreau is many things to many people, a presence to be reckoned with. And as remarkable as it may appear to many, the world never seems to get enough of him. He wears well. And at times, even I find myself wondering why. But perhaps that is one of the reasons we're here, to ask some pertinent questions about the phenomenon that is Henry Thoreau, and in addition, to seek some fresh insights into the life, works, and legacy of a writer for whom many feel or share a spiritual kinship, and a writer for whom many more fondly nourish an abiding interest, a titillating fascination, or just a nagging curiosity. Over the years, interest in Thoreau of one sort or another, and for one reason or another, has mushroomed. As the author of Ecclesiastes wrote many years ago, of making many books there is no end. Thoreau, we may be sure, has done more than his share to assure the truth of that observation. His book Walden alone, in the 132 years since its publication, has gone through 200 or more separate editions, several of which, as Walter Harding has pointed out, ultimately ran to over 500,000 copies each. Even before the 100th anniversary of its publication in 1954, the last time I made a count, Walden had already been translated into German, Dutch, Russian, Japanese, French, Czech, Italian, and Swedish. And if doctoral dissertations are any sign in our time of Thoreau's continuing popularity, not to mention his significance, Thoreau ought to be near the top of the literary rating charts. For in the decade of the 70s, no fewer than 60 dissertations inspired by the Concord-Sauterer were completed. Nearly half of all the dissertations ever written about him and his work. Michael Meyer has said of these dissertations, that is, those completed in the decade of the 70s, that the titles of the dissertations read like a Whitman catalog, and that the multiple points of view they represent should not be surprising, considering the nature of their subject. Now, the subject of the ingenious doctoral candidates is our subject as well. And I am sure that multiple points of view concerning Thoreau will also be ours during this symposium. It's more fun that way, and Thoreau is a fun subject. But on top of all the tomes made by the dissertation writers, there are also, in gracious abundance, the many, many books made by Thoreau's biographers and the host of literary critics who have found and are still finding in Thoreau a never-ending cornucopia supplying never-ending grist for their constantly multiplying volumes. And this has been the case increasingly so since the publication in 1873 of Ellery Channing's appreciative biography of his friend, which he entitled Thoreau the Poet Naturalist, to that of a book just published by Link C. Johnson called Thoreau's Complex Weave, which has been touted as a biography of Thoreau's week on the Concord and Merrimack rivers. In the meantime, however, in the 113 years intervening between Channing and Johnson, no other American writer has been so variously lionized, eulogized, criticized, categorized, canonized, and yes, even psychoanalyzed by his critics, friendly and at times not so friendly, as has Henry Thoreau. Everything from Thoreau's interest in the American Indian to a detailed probing into the problems presented him by an underdeveloped libido has been given book-length treatment. His critics have examined everything from his scatology to his epistemology. Yet, despite all, despite Link Johnson's book, which contends that Thoreau's A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers is one of the seminal works of the American literary Renaissance, and despite Sharon Cameron's recent attempt in her book, Writing Nature, Henry Thoreau's Journal, to establish Thoreau's journal as an autonomous work, competitive with Walden, Thoreau, outside of scholarly circles, and perhaps too often even there, is generally regarded as a man of one book, Walden, and one essay, Civil Disobedience. And unless I miss my guess, this symposium will focus attention on these two works and give only a nod in passing to the rest of the Thoreau canon. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting that there's anything wrong with that. No doubt the essence of Thoreau is in these two works. One, an acknowledged masterpiece of self-examination and revelation. The other, a defiant cry in defense of the supremacy of conscience and of a life lived in accordance with the higher law. In the mid-1840s, while in New York, as tutor to William Emerson's children, a homesick and dissatisfied Thoreau associated there with the likes of Horace Greeley, Arthur Brisbane, and William Henry Channing, reformers all, who were caught up in the heady business of establishing ideal communities throughout the northeastern United States after the fashion and the model of Fourier. Thus, either while in New York or shortly after his return to Concord, Thoreau conceived the idea of establishing a one-man, ideal community where he could carry out individually an experiment in what he called Spartan simplicity of life and elevation of purpose. Consequently, on the 4th of July, 1845, a date no doubt deliberately chosen for its symbolic significance, Thoreau moved into his 10 by 15 foot, $28 laboratory on a western slope overlooking Walden Pond. There, at the age of 28, lacking 8 days, and apparently in command of all his faculties, the Harvard graduate quietly began his sojourn at Walden. Ticknor and Fields, more than 9 years later, on the 9th of August, 1854, the Boston house of Ticknor and Fields published Thoreau's account of his experiment by the pond in an unattractive little book with lemon yellow end papers and dark covers. On the day of its publication, Thoreau's friend Horace Greeley announced the fact to all of the readers of the Tribune, declaring that the book would be available the next day at G.P. Putnam's bookshop at the price of $1. But even at that price, the book did not immediately become a bestseller. In fact, the 2,000 copies met the demand for the book for the remaining 8 years of Thoreau's life. This is not to say that Walden was ignored to the extent that Thoreau's earlier book had been. Indeed, some of Thoreau's contemporaries read Walden and weighed what he did at the pond, and as a consequence came to some interesting, if generally uncomplimentary, conclusions about the man they came to regard variously as a lusus, a poser, a narcissistic egotist, a malcontent, a misanthrope, an antisocial recluse, a skulker, and even a humbug who raised beans on the shore of Walden Pond and conversed there with woodchucks when he was not fighting the urge to eat one raw. In fact, one of the earliest reviews of Walden is entitled Town and Rural Humbug and appeared in the Knickerbocker for March 1855. Thoreau is there compared to P.T. Barnum, he of the one is born every minute fame. The anonymous reviewer dubbed Thoreau a conquered philosopher, or modern Diogenes, who built himself in the woods on the bank of a pond of pure water, deep enough for drowning purposes if the bean crop failed, a tub of unambitious proportions into which he crawled. But Thoreau did not live to read the most scathing of all the judgments and criticisms leveled at him by his contemporaries, the ones that inflicted on his reputation, literary and personal, the severest damage. Even his erstwhile mentor, Emerson, in his eulogy of Thoreau in the August 1862 issue of the Atlantic Monthly, labeled Thoreau a born Protestant, a man of many renunciations, a hermit and stoic, a man of no ambition, whose virtues sometimes ran into extremes. Of Emerson's eulogy, Walter Harding has said that perhaps no single work has had such a wide influence on the reputation of Thoreau. And that influence, I might add, was far from salutary. But it was perhaps James Russell Lowell, in a review ostensibly of the 1865 edition of Thoreau's letters edited by Emerson, who dealt Thoreau's posthumous reputation the severest blow, a blow from which it reeled for a quarter of a century. Lowell concluded that, and I'm quoting here, Thoreau seems to us to have been a man with so high a conceit of himself that he accepted without questioning and insisted on our accepting his defects and weaknesses of character as virtues and powers peculiar to himself. Was he indolent? He finds none of the activities which attract or employ the rest of mankind worthy of him. Was he wanting in the qualities that make success? It is success that is contemptible, and not himself that lacks persistency and purpose. Was he poor? money was an unmixed evil. To be of use was to him the most killing bait of the wily tempter uselessness. He condemns a world the hollowness of whose satisfaction he had never the means of testing. James Russell Lowell. But Lowell was a pussycat in comparison to another of Thoreau's contemporaries, the Reverend William Ronceville Alger, pastor of the Bullfinch Street Society in Boston. But fortunately for Thoreau, not nearly as many people read Alger's June 1866 piece in the monthly religious magazine as no doubt read Lowell's October 1865 piece in the widely read and influential North American Review the year before. The essay, that is Alger's essay, entitled Apostle of Solitude, when it was reprinted in Alger's book entitled Solitude of Nature and Man, or The Loneliness of Human Life, was a no-holds-barred attack. Alger declared that Thoreau directed his poisonous sleet of scorn manward, and that his scorn was Thoreau's revenge on man for not being what he wanted man to be. That scorn was also, Alger said, an expression of his unappreciated soul reacting in defensive contempt to keep him from sinking below his own estimate of his own deserts. He shut his real self in a cell of secrecy and devoted his life, Alger noted, to the art of interior aggrandizement of himself. He is constantly, Alger said, with all his boastful stoicism, and I like this. Not that I agree with it, but I like it. He is constantly, speaking of Thoreau, Alger said he is constantly, with all his boastful stoicism, feeling himself, reflecting himself, fondling himself, reverberating himself, exalting himself, incapable of escaping or forgetting himself. That's what you people have come here, you know, to pay homage to the fellow that did all those things. Anyway, Alger also discovered that Thoreau had said that Thoreau said, sometimes when I compare myself with other men, it seems as if I were more favored by the gods than they. And that, he had said, Alger discovered that Thoreau had said, that when I realize the greatness of the part I am unconsciously acting, it seems as if there were none in history to match it. But the truth is, Alger said, that his self-estimate and ambition were inordinate, and his willingness to pay the price of their outward gratification a negative quantity. All of this, then, says Alger, was reflected in Thoreau's art, which he found to be characterized in the main by three chief tricks. First, a direct self-enhancement by a boundless pampering of egotism. Secondly, an indirect self-enhancement by a scornful depreciation of others. Thirdly, a magnifying of every trifle related to self by associating it with a colossal idea. Thus, from some of his contemporaries, poor Henry's reputation took a licking. And it was not until the last 2 decades of the 19th century that a change set in. But as the years separated Thoreau farther and farther from his contemporaries and from his own time, and he could be viewed with more objectivity, the attitude toward him of distrust and distaste began to give way to heartfelt appreciation. In 1891, Samuel Arthur Jones wrote somewhat prophetically in the August issue of Lippincott's. Jones said, "Time is doing its kindliest offices for Thoreau. One after the other misrepresentations are being brought to judgment, and there is reversal with costs. Lowell, the chief offender, is already condemned by all but the vulgar. Thoreau is no longer considered a misanthrope, nor is he deemed a hermit who masqueraded at Walden Pond. The seriousness of his life is being recognized. His earnestness is seldom questioned. That he studied the problems of life as profoundly and as continually as did Marcus Aurelius, and that he lived regally, will soon be seen. And indeed it was. Thus, in the midst of the celebration of the centennial of Thoreau's birth, Norman Foerster, then Dean of American Literary Scholars, could tell the readers of The Nation magazine, The Nation, in the July 5th, 1917 issue, that 100 years from his birth and some 50 years from his death, Thoreau had come into his own, perhaps more than his own. Foerster declared Thoreau's life to have been a quest for the Holy Grail, undertaken in all purity of body and mind and soul, and in the fullness of faith and devotion. His personality, Foerster wrote, is so pronounced and at the same time so subtle and so various that he is inevitably many things to many people. To illustrate his point, Foerster ran through the list of epithets that earlier had been hurled at Thoreau. He has been regarded, Foerster noted, as an American Diogenes and a rural Barnum, as a narrow Puritan, a rebel against Puritanism, and a German Puritan romanticist, as a poet naturalist, as a sentimentalist, as a hermit, as a loafer, as a poser, as a prig and skulker, as a cynic, as a stoic, and as an Epicurean. But, Foerster concluded, the one encouraging fact is that he is permanently what he is. Our task, Foerster said, therefore, a century after his birth, is still in the main one of discovery. And with your permission, I would like to echo Foerster and say that here, on the 2nd and 3rd of April, 1986, 169 3/4 years since his birth, 149 1/2 years since he began at Emerson's suggestion to keep a journal, 140 years since he spent a night in Concord jail, 132 1/2 years since the publication of Walden, and 124 years since his death. Our task and privilege, I think, is still one of discovery. This symposium is an opportunity for discovery. Discovery about Thoreau's responses to the arts and the humanities, about his love of nature and his concern for the environment, about his views on political and social issues, and about his various responses to the demands of the ethical life. Already, there have been those along the way who have made discoveries in Thoreau of great relevance for themselves, for others, and even for us in our time. Mahatma Gandhi first read Walden in Johannesburg, South Africa in 1906. There is no doubt, Gandhi said later, that Thoreau's ideas greatly influenced my movement in India. Why, I actually took the name of my movement, Gandhi said, from Thoreau's essay on the duty of civil disobedience, written about 80 years ago. Until I read that essay, Gandhi noted, I never found a suitable English translation for my Indian word, satyagraha. Professor George Hendrick, who will be leading the discussion tomorrow on Thoreau and the ethical life, is the authority on Thoreau's influence on Gandhi. So I will step very gingerly here. Since Professor Hendrick warned several years ago about claiming too much credit for Thoreau. Suffice it then to say at this point that Gandhi found in Thoreau an eloquent statement of principle, and an example of the modus operandi that would ultimately break the back of the British power in India. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. said that he read Civil Disobedience during his college days, and that he was fascinated by the idea of refusing to cooperate with an evil system. I became convinced then, he said, that non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. No other person, Dr. King wrote in the early 1960s, has ever been more eloquent and passionate in getting his ideas across than Henry David Thoreau. As a result of his writings and personal witness, Dr. King observed, we are heirs of a legacy of creative protest. It goes without saying, he continued, that the teachings of Thoreau are alive today. Indeed, they are more alive today than ever before. And in the view of some who feel that they are in a position to know, the most significant result of Dr. King's application of the Thoreauvian principle of nonviolence is the very survival of America as we know it. For instance, Atlanta Mayor Andrew Young, an early King disciple, in commenting on the King legacy commemorated by the recent Martin Luther King holiday, is quoted as saying in a widely circulated New York Times story that America right now without Martin Luther King would look like Beirut. And I mean, he explained, that everybody in Atlanta had guns. And if when they bombed Martin Luther King's house in 1955, and everybody brought their guns out, he had said, let's go get them, it would have been a different America. You had people, Young said, coming back from the Second World War, who had been trained by the U.S. government in demolition techniques. There was no shortage of military experience, Young said. The society could not have survived, Young said, had it not been for the ideal of nonviolence. Is Thoreau, then, to be credited philosophically with preventing a national bloodbath? In 1962, the Reverend Trevor N.W. Bush, a leader in the banned African National Congress, an organization dedicated to the abolition of apartheid in South Africa, wrote John Hicks of the Massachusetts Review that Thoreau's influence in South Africa has been extremely important, and our struggle to win rights for the oppressed non-white population of our country has been assisted profoundly by the fearless liberal teachings and example of your great philosopher and prophet. If Thoreau were alive today, Bush declared, he would certainly join forces with those who resist racial intolerance and the evils which flow from it. Shortly after the Reverend Mr. Bush wrote his letter, Nelson Mandela was imprisoned for invoking what Bush had referred to as the spirit of Harper's Ferry, which, he said, must never be forgotten by those who are called to be reformers of the national life. And Mandela still languishes in a South African jail. Meanwhile, however, Bishop Desmond Tutu has espoused the cause, and at least for the time being has donned the Thoreauvian type nonviolent mantle. But he has warned that time is running out, and that the spirit of John Brown may still be unleashed, as he said recently in Dr. King's former pulpit in Atlanta. In our admiration for Thoreau's brooded, that is, noised about, praised, passive resistance, we often overlook, and most likely by design, that Thoreau approved of what John Brown did, since John Brown acted from principle. To Thoreau, John Brown was a golden man, a freedom fighter who refused to cry uncle, Did I say that? I'll hate myself from saying that. Forgive me, Henry. Thoreau and Gandhi, King, Bush, and Tutu. I can imagine someone saying, oh, come now. Aren't you perchance going just a wee bit overboard in claiming that Thoreau had a significant part in significantly changing the political history of India, that he contributed a morally defensible strategy to the achievement of Dr. King's dream, and that his continuing presence in the struggle for freedom based on human dignity at the tip of Africa? Overboard? Perhaps so. But a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a symposium for? After all, I am only reporting with perhaps just a tad of editorial emphasis and license. But back a bit in time, and a bit more personal. In the Depression days and the post-Depression days of the 1930s and 40s, students of Thoreau, conditioned by the trauma of the times, became increasingly interested in Thoreau's social, economic, and political thought. I was one of them. In the late 1940s, after WW2, the big one, I made a study of Thoreau as a critic of society. One of the earlier attempts at making such an assessment. I was impressed with Thoreau's assertion that the standing miracle of man is man, and by the thread I found running through all of his social philosophy, his insistence on the worth of the individual. That was the kind of thing some of us wanted to hear in those days. Thoreau had observed that the laboring man had become the pawn of a vicious system that consumed his energies from dawn to sunset in a struggle to secure a hand-to-mouth existence. Some of us who came through the Great Depression knew from experience what he was talking about. It was against this reprehensible dehumanization that threatened to brutalize the individual that Thoreau directed his keenest shafts. He discovered that the product, not man, too often became the desideratum, and that the machine itself too often became a sinister, enslaving, heartless tyrant. Yet Thoreau realized that man must earn his living, but it should be a living honestly gained, a living as little tainted by industrialism and trade as possible, a simple living, a poetic living. Thoreauvian simplicity of living demanded that man's material wants be kept at a minimum, lest the labor required to satisfy the wants become drudgery, and man, absorbed with the material, become insensible to the higher wants of his nature. When it came to politics, Thoreau was not naturally politically minded, and he would have concerned himself very little with politicians, politics, indeed with government itself, if government had not threatened to trample underfoot the individual, and if his conscience had not been an unrelenting taskmaster driving him to the defense of the individual. Thoreau was not willing to recognize any government per se. Its only right to exist was to be found in its protection of the inalienable rights of the individual to freedom and independence. Like Kant, Thoreau discovered a sure basis for government as well as human conduct in the moral law. Yet he found the most zealous of the abolitionists and reformers of his day decrying, for example, the unjust slave laws because they were unconstitutional, not because they were in direct violation of the moral law. The only constitution Thoreau had any reverence for was that which was inscribed in the inner being of man by the Creator. Thus, in his view, any government must respect a man's conscience as a law transcending its statutes. A man's duty of obedience is first to the laws of his own nature and to the government only as the laws of that government are compatible with and in harmony with the laws of his own being. Therefore, Thoreau asserted the right of the individual to resist unjust demands of the civil authority He wished to cast the weight of human personality and the force of men of principle against the iniquity of government, to resist passively its encroachments and abuses of power whenever possible. Thoreau also subscribed to the idea of the potential perfectibility of man, and it was inevitable, therefore, that he would gravitate toward the principle of philosophical anarchism. Without his deep faith in the individual's potential to develop through self-culture to the point where civil government would become unnecessary, Thoreau would have had little, if any, basis on which his philosophical anarchism could rest. Therefore, he could declare, as he did in Civil Disobedience, that when man had realized his potentialities, he would no longer need the impediment of government. In a society where reason and conscience met in harmony, in a brotherhood of enlightened and self-cultured individuals. I published my findings in a couple of articles in the late 1950s. But in 1977, my friend Michael Meyer complained in his Several More Lives to Live, Thoreau's political reputation in America, that no one had taken in hand to put Thoreau's social and political thought in any kind of historical perspective as that thought relates to our own day and time. And of course, Mike was right. He found Thoreau in the late 1920s still thought of primarily as a nature writer. But near the end of the decade, Vernon Parrington, in his main currents in American thought, called Thoreau an unterrified Jeffersonian Democrat and underscored the significance of his political thought. In the 30s, there was a general political shift to the left. But some of the liberals who embraced Thoreau, says Meyer, could never fully rid themselves of their suspicion and fear that the Roosevelt New Deal might interfere with the freedom of the individual to direct his own life. Then in the late 30s and early 40s came the war in Europe, and Thoreau was used in some quarters as an argument for isolationism and non-intervention in old world problems. In the late 40s and 50s, with the war now over, Thoreau came to be viewed more and more as a literary artist at the expense of his social and political reputation, since during those years the critics tended to avoid questions of politics. The fear of fear itself had been replaced by the fear of communism, which Senator Joe McCarthy had orchestrated into an all-out witch hunt. Thoreauvian ideas may well have been regarded then as out of step with the times. And incidentally, we are still waiting for someone with real courage to give us an honest appraisal of Thoreau's influence in the student unrest of the late 1960s and in the Vietnam War protests. Anniversaries have, by and large, been kind to Henry. In early May 1962, in connection with the centennial celebration of his death, Thoreau was inducted into the New York University Hall of Fame with appropriate Euhemeristic honors. Other such gatherings were held in Concord, where the 1,700-member Thoreau Society meets faithfully each July, in Washington, D.C., in Logan, Utah, and in Tokyo, Japan. In 1967, the United States Postal Service struck off a commemorative stamp honoring Thoreau on the 150th anniversary of his birth. It pictured a frail, bearded, cadaverous, hollow-eyed Thoreau. This may have been one of the reasons why the East Village Other newspaper published in Greenwich Village featured on the first page of a 1967 issue an enlargement of the postage stamp and proclaimed Thoreau one of America's first hippies. That's a new one added. To be sure, the hippie counterculture, like Thoreau, rejected commercialism, materialism, consumerism, cold rationality, and competitiveness. But it did not matter to the newspaper, at least, that Thoreau hated cities rejected the use of stimulants in any form as harmful to spiritual fulfillment, or that he would hardly have disturbed the frogs by strumming on a guitar. However, if the hippies reflected the rebellion of the young against the mores and hang-ups of their day, the yuppies reflect the consummate quest for the material in ours. Thoreau might have had some feeling of sympathy for the hippies. For the yuppies, never. See, I make statements like that because I figure that ought to shall we say, stimulate some discussion in this symposium. But in the 1950s and 60s, something began which may have already run its course, but something nonetheless that has already added a new dimension to Thoreau scholarship. Perhaps it is some kind of malicious streak in me that will not let me end my remarks without this coda. Or maybe Thoreauvian honesty demands that this new approach be mentioned if we are going to take an honest look at how Thoreau is perceived in our time. So here goes. In 1957, Raymond Ghazi completed a doctoral dissertation at New York University entitled Tropes and Figures, a psychological study of David Henry Thoreau, not Henry David. The dissertation was a Freudian exploration of Thoreau's unconscious life. Impressed with Ghazi's work, Carl Bode, who edited an edition of Thoreau's poems and assisted Walter Harding with the letters, published in 1962 an essay which he entitled The Half-Hidden Thoreau. Ghazi had not gone far enough for Bode. He wanted a fuller exploration of Thoreau's inner life than Ghazi had made. Let's face it, Bode contended, Thoreau was not a normal man. Though Bode insisted, his writings are the richer for it. Bode said, he was normal enough in replaying the Oedipus myth, in wishing to marry his mother, in wishing to replace his father, and in suffering therefrom a feeling of guilt. But, says Bode, it was not normal to have the effects linger throughout manhood and maturity. In Bode's view, Thoreau never outgrew his mother fixation, and thus could respond only to older women like Lydia Emerson, Ralph Waldo's wife. But since nothing in his culture could countenance a mother fixation, Thoreau shifted his psychic energies to the idea of Mother Nature. And because of the inadequacies of his father, whom he wished to displace, he was compelled to search for a father substitute. Now, Emerson was the most likely candidate, but Emerson proved unsatisfactory, according to Bode, especially after Thoreau fell in love with Lydia Emerson. It was not until late in life, Bode says, that Thoreau found his father substitute in old John Brown of Osawatomie. Then 15 years after Bode's salvo, Richard Lebeau in 1977 published his Young Man Thoreau, an Ericksonian probe of Thoreau's inner being. Echoing Bode, Lebeau also found Thoreau the victim of growing up in the shadow of an extraordinarily strong-willed, sharp-tongued, and dynamic mother, and a relatively quiet, meek, and unambitious father. It behooves us to see Thoreau as a complex and tortured man, Lebeau says, even if this is not what we want to see. But before Lebeau could get on with his second volume that would examine psychologically what drove Thoreau to Walden, Richard Bridgman, shades of William Ronceville Alger, came out swinging in 1982 with his dark Thoreau. Thoreau, Bridgman argued, was a deeply pessimistic man, had a hostile, punishing streak in him that demonstrated the severe tension that existed between his temperament and his idealism. and that as a consequence his writings contain certain bizarre passages that can be attributed only to psychological strain. Thoreau longed for a home, says Brigham. But to him a home was not a place where he could express his yearning for a heterosexual union, for marriage would bring with it fleshly obligations he could not easily entertain. Like Bodie, Bridgman found that Thoreau then transferred his sexual feelings to nature. In 1984, LeBeau published his second volume, which he entitled Thoreau's Seasons. LeBeau says that Walden Pond took on for Thoreau the qualities of both mother and lover, but that, after leaving the pond, Thoreau transferred his affections to Lydia and Emerson. A fact, says LeBeau, that may have intensified his need to free himself from Emerson's influence. But LeBeau believes that as a man without offspring and probably without interpersonal sexual experience, Thoreau focused his attention on generative organic facts and analogies in nature that he could safely examine without being shocked. Even so, LeBeau maintains that Thoreau still had a generative urge, which his active participation in the John Brown episode is a clear manifestation of. An argument, I must admit, that escapes me. Figure that one out. So, enough of this now then for the time being. Enough about the many-faceted Thoreau, truly a man who is many things to many people. No other American writer is such a natural, I think, no other American writer is such a natural for a symposium. Has any other American writer who still occupies center stage been so variously praised and so soundly maligned as has Thoreau? Has any other American literary figure said so much, to the point, to so many, for so long, about so many vital and continuing concerns as has Thoreau? I commend the Planning Committee on its perception, whether intuitive or not, in settling upon Henry and thereby virtually assuring that we, at this symposium, would spend a good part of 2 days in the joy of discovery, in the fun of give and take, with the privilege, yea, even obligation, of voicing our views about Thoreau, whatever they are.
Thank you. Dr. Dedmond would be willing and eager to answer questions if there are any.
We have such experts here that I could pass them off to someone else, like my good friend Leonard there. Someone else could ask one I don't know anything about.
You made a couple of comments that I'd like to tie together and ask
All right.
for your ideas. You mentioned that no one has done some serious in-depth work about his connection with the 60s and the Vietnam War. And then you said earlier, much earlier, that over half of the dissertations were written in the 1970s, procedurally when the
Between 1960 and
okay,
1970.
when those students were same students were getting into graduate school. I was wondering what some of those titles were of those dissertations, and some of the ideas maybe that they themselves were starting to get at as angles on Thoreau for that time period.
Some of you fellows help me out. I don't really.
Well, I recall, for instance, a good number of the dissertations are either still about Thoreau as a naturalist, or they're about Thoreau as a writer, the stylist. Of course, it was still a little early for Vietnam War to really be having an impact on those dissertations.
Well,
People who are
the dissertations were written. Well, that's right. I did say the decade of the 70s. That's right.
The 70s, and maybe we
But
should
as far as
start-
I know, I don't know of a good study of, if anybody's made a study of Thoreau's influence on the student unrest particularly, and then, which was part of the, I think, the Vietnam War protest. Maybe someone can help me out here. I don't know of a good study that was made, or anybody's ever attempted, really, to assess what influence Thoreau might have had on that student movement. I'd like to know about a study, if there is one. And, and as far as the dissertation, I'll have to admit that I can't give you a list of titles, because I really didn't go check them. I was simply here was quoting my friend Mike Meyer, who had done what you're asking, but I can't give you the titles of the dissertations.
It's quite right, but the bulk of the dissertations were on Thoreau as a writer, and dealt with the aesthetic aspects of the formal achievement of the writer. Very little work has been done recently in the last 10, 20 years on Thoreau within his culture, Thoreau within his time. Not all that much work has been done recently on some of the themes that are going to be discussed in the symposium, and that's perhaps one of the remarkable features about the symposium.
Any other questions? So we've got real experts here, we've got people who direct these theses and dissertations. They could tell you really what the students have been writing about.
Yeah, I was wondering, well, we heard some opinions of people on Thoreau's childhood and everything like that. I was wondering, truthfully, what kind of childhood did he have?
I don't really think we know anything much about his childhood. Do we, Leonard?
Well, George can tell you that when Thoreau was grammar school age, he would go with his brother John and his parents on nature walks. His parents loved these nature walks, and his father liked nature as much as his mother did. At least if we can believe Horace Hosmer, whose letters George Hendrick has edited. Maybe I should let George speak. But I would say the psychoanalytic approaches that have been offered so far are based on an absence of evidence. That is, it's that curious kind of logic that the absence of certain kinds of evidence becomes a deafening kind of evidence.
Dr. Jones, whom you quoted from earlier, was very much interested in this question and made serious inquiries among people in Concord who still knew the Spanish. And what he discovered was that the mother was not really the shrew that she was always being presented as. And as Leonard has said, the father was certainly not the quiet and absolute quiet and meek man that he had been presented as.
Yes, I hope you realize that I was making all kinds of apologies for throwing into psychoanalytic there at the end. And I agree with Leonard. I think it's not, there's a whole lot of reading of something into something, and it is deciding what you want to read into it and then reading into it, but with certain conclusions these people come up with.
But there is the rivalry with John that's very real for the same woman. There is the sympathetic
Yeah,
lockjaw,
that's
which
right.
almost killed him. We had that, I like the liberal book first.
And you know, we had back in my day, my graduate school day, we didn't have well, we had one biography, one, well, not like more than one, but one that was a recent biography, one by Henry Seidel Candy. And Candy, way back there in the 30s, came up with that idea that Thoreau was in love with Emerson's wife. And I think also, probably, am I right about this, that Candy also brings in a bit about the Ellen Sewell business. Yes, Thoreau and his brother was in love with the same woman when brother died, Thoreau was supposed to have had such a sense of guilt that his brother died of lockjaw, and he developed a case of sympathetic lockjaw, self-punishment for, I suppose, wanting what his poor brother who had passed away also wanted. And these books that I mentioned, the ones by LeBeau and the ones by Friedman, they're fascinating. I've read them with a great deal of interest. Find myself writing in the margins, all the things that I shouldn't be writing in the margins. Nevertheless, they were interesting books.
In regard to his question about the student movement, we had here about 4 or 5 years ago the original works of the artists that contributed to the, I think, great ideas of Western civilization. I can't think of the company now that sponsored that, packing company, Container Corporation. And I was remembering my own experience of all the posters that I saw during that period in student quarters and on the campus and in East Village and elsewhere. The one with the fellow playing the flute and the quotation about the drummer seemed to be the most popular. And the young lady who represented the packing company mentioned the popularity of those, because they had a little catalog and you could write for, you say you get one for $2 or $1, something like this. And if you pleased impoverishment, she'd send you all a free, as she did to me. In the course of the conversation, I think she mentioned that with one by Ben Shawn, and had the Ben Shawn one, caricature of Nixon, saying something about when you haven't told the truth, and I can't quote the rest of it. I might even be able to do the thorough one, but it seemed to me, she said those were the 2 most popular ones that people were writing in for. That's not very solid evidence.
Well, that's interesting to me. I didn't know that. But when I was writing this paper, I just couldn't think of any study that attempted to. We had all kinds of studies about almost everything I could think of, but no, that was one that I just didn't, I couldn't find, I couldn't remember, I didn't know of a study.
I wonder if the testimony, though, of many of the young men who faced draft boards and hearings must have done a lot of quoting from civil speaking. I would think there'd be a rich bit of literature from those hearings.
Anything else? I like your question because I said I got the experts here. I can pass them off to all sorts of people.
We've been speaking about Thoreau falling in love with Emerson's wife, but you read A. Wilson's recent life of Emerson, it sounds more like Gideon was the aggressor in this movie.
And to read a life of, Michael Lear's, the latest biography of Emerson, he makes the point, I think makes the point, he makes it very, very, very convincingly that Lydian was a woman who was very, very much neglected by Emerson. And that may have been the reason why she turned somewhat in another direction.
As they say in professional wrestling, we have a full card of events tomorrow. I do encourage you to check your program and find any and all of them that you might be really interested in attending. If there are no further questions, thank you. We have refreshments in the music lounge down the hall and to the right. I'm delighted that you're here, and I hope we see you tomorrow.